No, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. And I am talking about something, Dr. Harris, thank you. I love it. You big global picture, and now I'm going to bring it down to kind of something slightly smaller and to children. So what I'm going to do, and everyone can hear me in the back, the mic's working now, right? You guys, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the definition of childhood obesity, complications of it, and also just childhood obesity here in Cayman. So just so everyone knows, because not all of us necessarily take care of children, how do we do this? So we base it on weight and height, and males and females are different, so that's also very important. And what we do is we calculate the body mass index. So it's weight in kilograms divided by the height squared, and you plot it on a growth chart. And these are what growth charts look like in case anyone hasn't ever seen them. My clinic is very lazy. I put it all in a health record now, and I don't need to worry about plotting it on growth charts anymore. But sometimes it's just nice to go back and look at these. So you can see the girl and the boy are obviously different. They're nice pink and blue, so that makes it easier. But when you look at these growth charts, you can see here, so when you actually calculate the body mass index, you plot it on this graph. So you can see here there's actually just 4 plots. Now I kind of wanted to go through this just in a little bit of detail so you guys know when we're talking about this what we're talking about. So you have the 5th percentile, you have the 50th percentile here, this is the 85th percentile, the 95th. So anything, so if we have a 10-year-old boy and his BMI is 13, we plot him here, so he's actually on the underweight category. You have the same 10-year-old boy but his BMI is 18 and he's plotted here, he's actually normal. If we have a 10-year-old boy, his BMI is 21 and he's plotted here, this is considered overweight. And if he's a 10-year-old boy and his BMI is 23, we plot him right here and he's considered obese. So this is a little different again from the BMI in adults, and that's really important for us to understand. You really do need to plot the children on this graph in order for you to interpret their BMI. So complications of childhood obesity, there are just so many, and I'm going to touch base on quite a few of these today. So, you know, there's neurological issues, there's lots of cardiovascular ones, which we'll talk about, the endocrine, which I'll focus on a little bit more. You have musculoskeletal, gastrointestinal, pulmonary. Psychosocial is also a very big one, and that's one thing we'll talk about because you do see this happening more and more in kids acting out in school because sometimes they're just teased. So with cardiovascular complications, just to start off with, you definitely see more of this in the overweight and obese kids. And when you look at any of these kids that are above that 95th percentile, which we talked about just now, there's a 3-fold risk of hypertension in these children. And what's interesting is quite often they have masked hypertension. And what masked hypertension means is that when they come into your office, you do a blood pressure on them, and the blood pressure most of the time looks okay. What happens is if you actually put an ambulatory blood pressure monitor on them, 50% of these kids have hypertension. So that's a lot of children with hypertension, and they're running around and you're not even aware of it. So that's actually really important. So it's something that maybe we should start to do ambulatory blood pressures on these children when we see them, because we're really missing a lot of this. You can see a lot of dyslipidemia in these kids too, and again, it occurs amongst overweight and obese kids, especially the ones that have central fat distribution. The typical lipid profile you get, you see a very high LDL, a high triglyceride, and a low HDL. And so why I'm bringing this up, and this is kind of touching base on this, is when we look at the English Caribbean, and this was from a PAHO study, you can see here in the English Caribbean, what we are dying from are cardiovascular diseases and diabetes. The rest of these diseases are not quite as prevalent here, and so this is one of the reasons we really do need to focus on children when we see this. This is something we need to prevent. Gastrointestinal as well, these kids get fatty liver, and if you think about this, before 1980, we didn't even hear of fatty liver in children. I mean, it wasn't even reported in the literature. But now we do definitely see this, and you actually tend to see this in about 1 in 3 obese children. The problem with this is you go from a normal liver to a fatty liver to a cirrhotic liver, and you get irreversible organ damage. And quite often we don't know about this until it's too late. Pulmonary, again, like I said, I'm touching base on a lot of these because I want to get to diabetes because that's what I do. So just so you know. But obstructive sleep apnea, again, 8% of children with obesity have moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea. So we know how we feel, adults feel when they have obstructive sleep apnea. So it makes it's a problem for these children. And then obesity hypoventilation syndrome. This is rare, but it's life-threatening and something we have to be aware of. So you get extreme obesity and alveolar hypoventilation during wakefulness. So that's something, again, we all have to be very vigilant for. From an orthopedic point of view, you get the slipped capital femoral epiphyses, you get Blount disease as well, and you also get more fractures, musculoskeletal issues in these children. So these are all things when the kids come in, you have to think about a lot of these things when they present. Neurological too, you can get idiopathic intracranial hypertension. Sometimes, so the risk increases with severity of the obesity, and the odds ratio is about 16.14 for severe obesity. But they have headaches, they sometimes have nausea, vomiting. Again, it can sometimes be very nonspecific. They can have eye pain, visual loss, sometimes they can get double vision. So again, all sorts of all very important things for you to ask the children. Dermatologic issues, intertrigo, furunculosis, hidradenitis suppurative, which I just put a quick picture up there. And again, the psychosocial, they feel alienated quite often, these children. They have, their peer relationships quite often are not very good. They have a poor self-esteem, their body image is distorted. They have anxiety and depression. They feel discriminated against quite often in school, and you often see children who have this issue and they act out at these kids and get into trouble, and then they're bullies, and it becomes quite a severe cycle. And what's important too is when you compare these to non-obese kids, they're less likely to complete college and more likely to live in poverty, which was touched on in the last talk too. So from an endocrine point of view, you get hyperandrogenism in females, you get abnormalities in growth and puberty, which I will talk about a bit, impaired glucose tolerance, and as well as diabetes. So when you see these young girls in clinic, quite often they'll have the more androgenic. So you can either see hirsutism, or you can see this acanthosis nigricans, which you often see in kids. And I have so many mothers say, no, I try to wash that off and I scrub it and it doesn't come off. I'm like, no, it will never come off, And it's something about educating them that when you see this acanthosis nigricans, this is really an increase in insulin. We need to screen them for diabetes and talk to them about this stuff. You tend to see a lot more polycystic ovarian syndrome in these children. I'm always very careful to diagnose PCOS in kids because they quite often will have irregular periods for quite a few years, but it's something that we have to think about as well. So that's important. Growth in puberty is interesting as well. Now, what happens with these kids is when they're either overweight or obese, they actually grow quickly. So often you see these kids and they're very tall, and they tend to be very tall in their class. But what happens is they grow tall and they tend to fuse, start puberty early and fuse early. So they actually get to their height that they were going to always reach. They're not necessarily taller than everyone else. They just look taller when they're younger because they reach that height quicker. And they tend to go into puberty much younger as well. And again, that's something you have to watch for. When you think about impaired fasting glucose, so that's a fasting glucose over 100, it's present in 15% of overweight kids, 20% of obese children, and 22.5% of severely obese children. So again, this is something when you see these kids, you have to screen for this and see what's going on from a metabolic point of view. The CDC predicts that 1 in 3 children born after the year 2000 will have diabetes. This is terrifying me. I have 2 kids, I mean, a third one, and then I'm like, okay, well, which one? And it's just something that you have to sit there and think about, this is really serious. And so whenever I kind of put this up, I'm like, oh, wow, no, that's why I only have 2. I'm not having 3. So now this is an important question, and this kind of brings me now around to talking about type 2 diabetes in children. And this is a debate I have often. What would you rather have, type 1 or type 2 diabetes? And I will ask for hands up. So who would want type 1 diabetes? Yeah, see, type 2? Everybody, I know everyone wants, I don't want any, but so. Anyone? No? Okay, so anyone here for type 2 diabetes and would say why you would prefer type 2 diabetes? It's reversible, thank you,
It's reversible.
Sure, okay, fine. So this is interesting. So this is in children now, and I'm gonna bring this up. So these are in kids. So when you look at this study, these are looking at children. So this is a cumulative survival, and this is the duration of diabetes. Now what I want you to look at is this black line is type 2 diabetes in kids, and this top red line is type 1. So if you actually look at 10 years for duration, who started to die here quicker? Is it the type 1s or the type 2s? It's actually the type 2s, and this again I want to bring up is for children. When you look at them 20 years down the road, so if we look here, so again, it's the type 2s that are faring worse than the type 1s, but no one wants type 1 diabetes, right? Because nobody wants to inject themselves with insulin. Again, 30 years of duration. You can see here, you know, the difference becomes more marked the older they get. So this is telling you something about type 2 diabetes in children. So, you know, this is definitely something we need to address. And the problem is it's preventable, which is what a lot of people will talk about. You know, this is something that can reverse. So again, what would you rather have? Adult onset type 2 diabetes or youth onset type 2 diabetes? Sit there and think about it for a few minutes. And so, and again, let's just bring this up. So when you look at these kids, so this is the age of diagnosis, and this is the standardized mortality ratio. So if you look, so if you were diagnosed between the age of 15 and 29, your standardized mortality ratio is above 3. So this means you are much more risk of dying. You know, this is actually really serious. You can see as you get diagnosed when you're older, actually it decreases and you don't do quite as poorly. But it's something that happens to these kids when they have type 2 diabetes and they're diagnosed at this age. It's very aggressive and it's very severe and it's very difficult to control, you know. I mean, a type 2 diabetic, and I'll go through some examples for this as well, because I think something like type 2 diabetes in kids, people are like, oh, well, you know, we can reverse it, we can do that. It's really hard to in kids. So when you look, and on my last slide, this kind of backs this up. So if you have an obese adolescent girl, her risk of dying by middle age is 2 to 3 times higher. And again, you know, this is not what any of us want for our children. It shortens life expectancy by 2 to 5 years. It's an equal effect to that of all cancers combined. So this is actually, we're doing a severe injustice to our children. When we look at diabetes, so 4% of adolescents, if their BMI is above 95, have asymptomatic type 2 diabetes. So we don't know about it. You know, they're running around, they have their diabetes, and for the most part, because they're young, they can get away with it for a while. We need an early diagnosis in these kids, and we need very aggressive treatment, very aggressive. And I think I'm going to talk about the treatment in a little bit, and you guys will be like, whoa, that's really aggressive. And you can kind of see why. You know, you can get, you know, retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, this cardiovascular disease that is one of the reasons these kids end up doing so poorly. These kids have a very rapid progression of diabetes-related complications. When you look at them, a lot of them already have comorbidities. You know, 13% of them have microalbuminuria, 80% have dyslipidemia, and 13% have hypertension. So again, it's very, very aggressive. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is just childhood obesity in Cayman, and it's a very important public health problem. We need to identify these kids that are overweight and obese, and we really need to focus on prevention. You know, we don't ever want our kids to get to this state. So if we look at the states, you know, the USA, 15% are overweight, 12% are obese, and so it's about a total of 27. Cayman in 2010, there were 533 screens, so 16% were overweight, 23% were obese. So we had a total of almost 40% of the kids screened in preschool. Remember that now, preschool children. These are like 4- and 5-year-olds. So 39% of are overweight. The next year, 16% were overweight, 14% were obese, and a total of 30%. So unfortunately, we're beating America. Again, this is just data from school-age children, so age 3 to 6. So you can see here, the blue is the overweight and the orange is obese. I must admit, 2010 was kind of an outlier year. When we go to a little older, so year 6 again, these kids are screened, and these are ages 10 to 14. You can see here that the overweight, it ranges between some 15 and 17%, but the obese, again, it's from 17 to 20%. So it's really significant numbers. And what I wanted to do is, if we look at this data and we look at 11-year-olds and pretend, you know, 500 of them are screened, that's not an unreasonable amount to think that are in a year. 17% are obese, so we have 85 obese kids. 3.5 of these kids will have asymptomatic diabetes. So if we go and just look at high school from ages 11 to 16, about 20 children in a high school will have asymptomatic type 2 diabetes. So what have we done to these poor kids? You know, we've set them up for cardiovascular disease, we've set them up for hypertension, we've set them up for dyslipidemia. You know, this is what we have to change. So I wanted to give you a couple of cases, and it's quite nice just to have cases because then you can kind of apply them to your day-to-day life. So I have a 16-year-old Hispanic female. She was diagnosed with diabetes 2 to 3 years ago by a primary care physician, who then dutifully started her metformin, which is not a bad idea. You know, I think it's an excellent idea. She reports she took it for a few months and then stopped taking it. Who has this patient in their clinic? So I do, a lot. 1 month ago, she was admitted to the hospital following a suicide attempt. So, you know, there's again all the mental health issues that come along with this, and we have to take these poor kids seriously. They have a tough time with this. Her glucose was 550. She had some glucosuria, ketones, normal electrolytes. Her A1C was 12.5, so she's not doing very well. She was started on basal insulin and discharged. Now, what I want to ask you now is what's most important next test to order? Lipids, fasting and stimulated C-peptide, home glucose measurements, liver enzymes, or pancreatic autoantibodies? Anyone have any idea? You have your thought, you have your answer in your head. So what is actually most important are her pancreatic autoantibodies, because with these kids, they can present with type 1 diabetes. And she actually had type 1 diabetes. And she needed to be on insulin and metformin, in all honesty. She needed both of them. She has what we call double diabetes, where they have type 1 and type 2. So one of the things I wanted to talk about with children is even though everything about them looks like they're type 2, you have to check their antibodies, because we do not want to miss a type 1 child, because eventually their insulin reserves will go down and then they will be in trouble. So that's incredibly important. Obesity is common in type 1 diabetes because we see obesity so much now. Type 1 occurs in race or ethnic groups, where type 2 is still more common in youth, but we have to check for it. So it's really important that we always check antibodies, and positive antibodies have to be treated with insulin. You know, you do not want to not treat these with insulin. So this is another really interesting study that I wanted to talk about. So youth with type 2 diabetes versus adults with type 2 diabetes. Because I have talked about, I don't wear a watch anymore, so I'm not sure of the time. Will someone just wave me if I'm running way over? So implications, this is a RISE study that was looking at pediatric medicine, and what they found is insulin resistance and beta cell dysfunction in youth were really unresponsive to metformin and glargine. And this is really interesting because it's not what happens in adults. So again, children are not little adults, children are children, you know, and we have to treat them differently. So when you look in adults, they actually have improvement in beta cell function when we put them in metformin. They have improvement in insulin resistance when we put them on insulin. They improve. When we do this to kids, once we take them off the medicine, it actually, they do get quite bad. It actually was worse than at baseline. So again, when you have type 2 diabetes in these kids, it is very different than type 2 diabetes in an adult. We have to have very early treatment of these youth, and you know, quite often you need 1, 2, 3 medications plus insulin to control them. Again, it's a very different population. So this is another one. So another adolescent with new onset type 2 diabetes. And this is the one where you guys might get a little horrified by me. So I have a 15-year-old Hispanic boy, long history of being overweight, fasting glucose of 289 during an annual exam, Tanner 5, BMI is 32, his blood pressure is 120/58, his A1C is 8.7, his antibodies are negative, so he does not have type 1. We put him at metformin, he does well, we titrated up to 2,000, he's doing okay. He comes back 3 months and he's been taking his metformin every day, and his mom's like, has been watching him. So I know he's taking it, and I know he's doing really well, and his A1C is now 7.1. So what do you do now? Do we measure a fasting C-peptide level? Do we measure a stimulated one? Do we start canagliflozin, start basal insulin, or start multiple daily injections? I didn't write do nothing, did I? So we're gonna do something with a kid. So again, have a think about that and think about what you would do. And what you should actually do is start him on insulin, which everyone goes, what? Are you serious? Well, again, this is something I always find really shocking as well too. So he's actually pretty close to the ADA guidelines of 7%. However, when you look, there's a Today study that was done that indicates if your A1C is over 6.3, after a few months of monotherapy, it's associated with a 4 to 10-fold increased risk of loss of glycemic control. So these kids, unless I have them to a normal A1C by the time they come back to see me, I need to bump up their diabetes medication in some form or another, because I know that they're going to become out of control. And you know, it feels premature to start it at his initial visit, and I wouldn't start it as his initial visit. You know, I would hope that the metformin and the lifestyle changes would help. But if his A1C is not down to a non-diabetic range, you have to bump up your aggressiveness with your medication. So you need to put on some add-on therapy. So these challenges are in effectively treating type 2 diabetes, and you highlight the need to prevent this. This is something that's really, really tough to treat. It's very tough to manage. So how did we get here? There's so many things, and there's so many things we can do. There are things like sugar-sweetened beverages, television, sleep. I love talking about sleep. Sugar-sweetened beverages. So one of the things I tell the kids when they come in is like, just cut out the juice. The juice is pointless. It doesn't give you any nutrition. Just eliminate it. You can actually get 10 to 15% of the calories in the kids from juices, which is concerning. Television. So the amount of time spent watching TV or the presence of a television in a child's bedroom are directly related to the prevalence of obesity in kids. So and I should change this to screens now, because I don't have a TV. I don't watch TV. I'm like, well, what do you watch? Oh, is it an iPad? I'm like, it's the same thing to me. But anyway, I'm like, oh, dates me a little bit. But that's really important too. And again, just turning off the TV, putting limitations on the screen time. You don't want them sitting there for 5 hours a day. And this was a study out of the Journal of Pediatrics in 2010 that had looked at physical activity and sedentary behavior amongst 34 countries. So more than 3 hours a day here in Cayman, and I'll show you a graph on the next slide, 53% of our boys were watching more than 3 hours a day and 64% of girls, and most of these were not active. And children who were sufficiently active were 18% of girls and 33% of boys. So when you can see here, so I highlighted Cayman and I put the line here. So the only people who watch more TV with us, I think that's St. Lucia under there, and no one beat us in the girls. So again, we watch too much TV. Sleep. Children are sleeping less. There's mounting evidence suggests an association between shortened sleep duration and obesity. And when you look at preschool kids, if you got them to bed before 8 o'clock, they actually have less obesity than if you got them to bed after 9. An hour. And it makes a big difference in these kids. If they have a persistently short sleep duration of less than 10 hours, it also increases the risk of excess weight or obesity. And endocrine causes are actually less than 1% of causes of obesity. Everybody's like, oh, maybe it's hypothyroidism, maybe it's Cushing's. Well, I do look for them, and I promise you I will look for them when they come to see me. But it's not really what I find. It's always some sort of environmental factor or something else that's going on. What can we do about it? Again, it's education. It's, educate the medical personnel, parents, children, teachers. It's a community effort in general. No one person is going to solve this. We all have to join together. It's hard to talk with parents. No one wants to talk about this, but you have to give them tools to talk about it about health with their patients. Plot the BMI at every single visit. That's really nice too, which is why I showed you, and so you guys all feel comfortable at least looking at it and being able to discuss it. Breastfeeding is very good too. Infants who are breastfed for 3 to 5 months are 35% less likely to be obese. So again, sometimes really simple things. Introduction to new foods is also important. Infants can refuse a new food up to 12 times. So be persistent. I put this up, and actually what I'll do is the AAP actually used to say no screen time for kids under 2. They've changed their recommendations recently, where if they're less than 6 months, you can use it for video chatting. I think they're trying to find some happy medium with people. 18 to 24 months, you can choose high quality programming, but you watch it with your child. You don't put them in front of the TV. You sort of explain to them why you're watching TV with them and why it's important. Again, 2 to 5 years, limit it to 1 hour a day. High quality programs. Parents should co-view media with their children. If they're over 6 years, place consistent limits on them, that it doesn't take the place of adequate sleep, physical activity, or other behaviors. And you always want media-free times together, such as when you're having dinner or driving, things like that. You don't want them in front of a screen all the time. And one thing too, ongoing communication about just, with screens and cell phones and stuff like that. It's very important. Sleep time for kids. So this is just, again, from the American Academy of Pediatricians. So the infants 4 to 12 months, they want 12 to 16 hours of sleep. Toddlers, 1 to 2 year old, need 11 to 14. Preschoolers, 3 to 5, 10 to 13. Grade schoolers, 6 to 12, 9 to 12 hours of sleep. And once you're 13 to 18, you need 8 to 10 hours of sleep. So again, this is very important for all of us to consider. Again, creating a healthy behavior. In health education, often only 9 hours per year is dedicated to this, but it's something that they actually show that if you introduce this in schools, and especially in the younger kids, you get more of an effect. A well-balanced diet and portion size. get kids to be active. Physical PE actually in schools is something that's always really very good. It's not only linked to cardiovascular benefits, but they have improved cognitive function and concentration as well in class. So sometimes it's simple things, you know, none of this stuff is crazy, none of this stuff is impossible to do. It's all just very simple things. You go to bed an hour earlier and, you know, be a little bit more active, turn the TV off an hour earlier. You know, these simple things you can do. Support to eat healthier and be active. It's very environmental. And again, education in children's and teachers, these school-based programs where you focus on kids from 6 to 12 years old are the best supportive strategies. It helps physical activity, nutrition, education. Parent-focused interventions are always good. More physical activity, reduced screen time, and nutrition. There is a food policy in our schools, which is quite nice, just in case you guys don't know about this. They do tell you, they do give guidelines for the schools and what they should feed the kids. And these were my references. So thank you so much.
Did you know that planning permission is required for an addition, alteration, or any material change to your house? The 10% rule no longer exists. Did you know you should check with the department as a planning and permit application may be required? Did you know your mailing address details on your land register must be up to date in order to receive notices on new development which may impact you? Visit Lands and Survey Department to check your mailing address is correct. Did you know that walls, fences located along the road require planning permission no matter the height? You should check with the department as a planning and permit application may be required. Did you know that fences and walls within the high water setback require planning permission no matter the height? You should check with the department as a planning and permit application may be required. Did you know that a trellis structure requires planning permission? You should check with the department as a planning and permit application may be required. Did you know that a deck more than 6 inches above finished grade requires planning permission? Did you know you should check with the department as a planning and permit application may be required? Did you know planning permission is required to clear land by mechanical means? You should check with the department as a planning and permit application may be required. Did you know that planning permission is required for a sign? Did you know you should check with the department as a planning and permit application may be required?